האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobre Vietcher. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Vayikra, Baruch Hashem. Together, we're all starting a new sefer in the Torah, Sefer Vayikra, and we're going to do Os Hey, section number 5. This is a lengthy section which needs to be divided into 3 parts. We're only going to do part 1 tonight. And I want to let everyone know ahead of time, in this section, primarily the Zera Shimshon is going to be asking questions. So it's going to be a little bit, some of you might feel unsatisfied at the end because a lot of questions are going to get answered. Only a little bit here and there will he answer some of the questions, but he's mostly setting us up in this first section with his questions, and then he starts really developing answers and ideas as he goes forward into the second and third parts of this drush. But we've got to start somewhere, so we're starting with the questions tonight. The subject matter is korbanos, sacrifices. Of course, Sefer Vayikra is known as the sefer of korbanos. And this piece talks about korbanos and also the connections between korbanos and tefillah, between sacrifices and prayer. Let's jump right in. So to begin this piece, the Zera Shimshon is going to bring down a Yerushalmi, a little excerpt from the Gemara Yerushalmi that talks about an incident that happened in Sefer Shmuel and Navi. And so let's just give a little context, a little background to that. When Sefer Shmuel begins, Sefer Shmuel, of course, focuses, at least in the beginning, on Shmuel Hanavi, the birth of Shmuel Hanavi, and his rise to become one of the great figures in Jewish life, the great Shmuel Hanavi, who ultimately anoints the first king, Shaul HaMelech, over the Jewish people, and then David HaMelech, the second king. But in the beginning of the story, Shmuel is taken in by the Kohen Gadol of that time, whose name was Eli HaKohen. Eli had 2 sons who helped him work in the Mishkan, and they were Chofni and Pinchas. And we find out about the fact that Chofni and Pinchas, Eli's sons, did some serious, not good things. They did some serious wrong things, and part of it had to do with delaying people who came to bring korbanos at the Mishkan, delaying that process and keeping them there. And we're not going to go into the details right now, but Hashem sends a message to Shmuel to give to Eli, and in the message he says that no forgiveness is going to, that Eli's sons, the house of Eli, cannot be forgiven, even through sacrifices. And that's what we're going to see right now in the first paragraph. Here we go. Os Hey, Vayikra, Os Hey. Yerushalmi Rosh Hashanah Perek Beis. The Gemara in Yerushalmi and Maseches Rosh Hashanah in the 2nd chapter quotes as follows. Rav Kahana Omar, Rav Kahana said, Im yiskaper avon beis Eli, bezevach uvemincha ad olam. The sin of the house of Eli will not be forgiven through sacrifices and through meal offerings forever. So even if the children of Eli, even if Eli are going to bring sacrifices and meal offerings, that's not going to bring kapara, it's not going to bring forgiveness for the sins that were committed. So the Gemara, so Rav Kahana says about that pasuk, "Bezevach umincha eino miskaper." Through a sacrifice and through a meal offering, forgiveness will not be gained. Aval miskaper hu betfila, but atonement could be gained through prayer. So that's a very powerful statement. If you look at the story in Sefer Shmuel, in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, and then Perek Gimel in the 3rd chapter in Sefer Shmuel, it looks like Hashem's whole point and whole message is that nothing can bring forgiveness for the house of Eli because of the sins that his sons were involved in, and because Eli apparently didn't do enough to stop those sins from continuing. Nothing can bring kapara, nothing can bring atonement. That's what the psukim seem to be saying. But Rav Kahana and the Gemara Yerushalmi says, no, look at the pasuk carefully. It sacrifices and meal offerings can't bring forgiveness, but tefillah, but the power of prayer is such that it could bring kapara, it could bring forgiveness for the people involved. Next paragraph. Hiksha hayefei mara. The commentary called Yefei Mara asked the following question. It's actually going to be two questions. These are the opening two questions of this piece, with many more questions to come. Kevan de bezevach umincha dafka de'eno miskaper. Since the pasuk was very specific in saying that sacrifices and meal offerings won't bring forgiveness, im kain, if so, b'chol mitzvah achriti yiskaper. That would imply that any other mitzvah could bring atonement. Since the pasuk went out of its way to specify that a zevach and a mincha, sacrifices and meal offerings, won't bring forgiveness, we should learn from that, the Gemara Yerushalmi should learn from that any other mitzvah, all kinds of other mitzvahs could bring forgiveness. Umay shna tefillah. So what's so unique? What's so special about davening tefillah? The ka'amar Rav Kahana, that Rav Kahana stated in the Gemara, tefei mishar mitzvos, that it is what could bring forgiveness more than other mitzvos. Let's pause over this very, very incisive question. So the Yefei Mara says, why did Rav Kahana deduce and jump to the conclusion that what the pasuk, the psukim, and Sefer Shmuel were attempting to say, what Hashem basically was attempting to say, is that forgiveness cannot be attained by the house of Eli through zevach and mincha, but it can be attained through prayer? Why did Rav Kahana pick prayer? Why didn't Rav Kahana say atonement will not be gained through zevach and mincha, but other mitzvos can bring atonement? Perhaps increasing their shmiras hamitzvos in terms of Shabbos or kashrus, or not speaking lashon hara, or being more careful about putting on tefillin or wearing tzitzis. Perhaps all kinds of giving tzedakah, for goodness sakes. Perhaps all kinds of other mitzvos could bring kapara. Why did Rav Kahana focus on and deduce that sacrifices can't bring forgiveness, but tefillah could bring forgiveness? That's the first question. The Ode Hiksha, and another question, the Yefei Mara asked another question. Almasha Amru Aval Miskaper Hu B'Tfila, on the statement that forgiveness can be brought through davening. Deha Bichlal Zevach Umincha Isa Nami L'Tfila. When a person brings a sacrifice and a meal offering, they also pray. They also say words of tefillah. And if they say words of tefillah, what does it mean to say that sacrifices don't work, but tefillah will work? Sacrifices involve tefillah. She'ikar hakorban hu havidoi ve'hatfillah she'imo. Because the main part of bringing a sacrifice is the vidoy, the confession, v'hatfilah, and the prayer, she'imo, that come with the korban. Dibalav hachi korban eino l'ratzon. Without those elements of vidoy and tefillah, words of confession and words of prayer accompanying the korban is not considered l'ratzon. It won't appease Hashem. Umikevan da'afilu bezevach umincha eino miskaper. And since the pasuk clearly stated that the house of Eli, the members of the house of Eli, could not gain atonement and forgiveness through bringing a sacrifice and a meal offering, then how much more so if they only davened? In other words, when they bring a sacrifice and a mincha, apparently that means they do the regular confession and davening that goes along with the sacrifices. So if that won't bring kapara, the sacrifices along with the tefillah and vidoy, then certainly just doing tefillah by itself can't possibly bring atonement. Ad kan lashono, until here is a quote from the Yefei Mara, V'ayin Shom, and the Zera Shimshon suggests that you look in that sefer to see specifically what he has to say, how he asks the questions, and how he answers those questions. But here we have a piece that starts with two very powerful, fundamental, and as we'll see, seminal questions that lead the Zera Shimshon to develop all kinds of ideas and important concepts that he wants to share with us as the piece continues. But these are the opening two questions, the first and second questions. And as we'll see, the Zera Shimshon is going to tackle the second question first. The second question is that that sacrifices also involve words of tefillah and vidoy, confession and prayer. So how can Rabbi Kahn say that prayer would work when the tefillah along with prayers did not work? Next paragraph. V'hine b'seirutz kushyoso hashenis yesh lomar. Behold, in terms of the answering the second question, we can say, De'in hachinami, that yes, it's true. She'ikar hakorban hu havidoy v'hatfila imo, she'imo. Yes, it's true that in general, a main part of bringing a korban, a sacrifice, is to say words of confession and prayer with the sacrifice. These words of confession and prayer were said at the time of the leaning of smicha. That means when a person is bringing a sacrifice does smicha, it means they lean, they put their hands on the head of the animal that is going to be offered, that's going to be sacrificed, and they lean, they shift their body weight onto the animal with their hands on the head of the animal. When they do that action, which is called smicha, that's when they say their tfilos and their vidoy. That's when they say any words of confessing sins and prayer that they need to say. Upasaka Rambam, and the Rambam decides or states the halacha. Beperek Gimel Mehilchos Maseh HaKorbanos, in the Rambam Sefer Mishnah Torah, in the section called Maseh HaKorbanos, in the third chapter, the Rambam says, Im lo samach, if a person did not do smicha, that means in a situation in which a person was supposed to do smicha, this leaning on the animal and putting the hands on the head of the animal and saying words of tefillah and vidoy, if a person was supposed to do that but did not do it, kiper, they still can attain atonement if they continue through and do all of the other things with the sacrifice that they're supposed to do. Shehasmicha eina me'akeves, because smicha, even though it's very important, is not me'akeves. It's not so vital that it holds a person back from fulfilling the mitzvah if they don't do it. Ela shemala alav ke'ilu lo kiper. Rather, what we say is we tell a person it's as if you're not going to get kapara if you don't do the smicha. In other words, we try to emphasize how important it is to do smicha, to lean on the animal and to say the words of vidoy and tefillah, prayer and confession. It's very important, and it's as if you're not going to get kapara if you don't do it. But Rambam comes right out and says black and white that if you don't do that smicha step, the step of smicha, if you don't do it, you don't say those words of tefillah and vidoy, you still attain kapara by bringing the sacrifice. V'hi brisa perakama dizvachim. This comes from a brisa in the first chapter of Maseches Zvachim dichsiv, that brings down a pasuk. V'samach v'nirtza lechaper. It says the person bringing the sacrifice will lean on the animal, v'nirtza lechaper, and it will be received to bring atonement for the person. V'af al pichein kiper. The brisa says even if the person doesn't do smicha, nonetheless they attain kapara. Kemoshe pirish Rashi v'ayin sham, as Rashi explains on that Gemara, and you could look there. The Shema Mino, we learn from this. Shahakorban mechaper kishem mischaret belibo. A sacrifice brings atonement even if a person only regrets the sins that he or she committed inside of their heart, in their own heart, meaning they're thinking about how badly they feel. Af below havidoy ve'hatfila, even without the explicit oral confession and words of prayer, dahainu maaseh hasmicha, which is done during the action, the step of smicha, of leaning on the animal. So that's a very important piece of information to know, as the Zera Shimshon will now use it to answer the Yefei Mara's second question. Umishum hachi, and because of that fact, Shapir Kamash Malon Kra, it makes sense that the pasuk in Sefer Shmuel is teaching us she'avon beis Eli lo yiskaper bezevach umincha lechud klal uklal, that the sin of the house of Eli could not be expunged, could not be atoned for through sacrifices and minchas alone. If a person, if the sons of Eli, if the other members of Eli's household were to bring sacrifices and meal offerings by themselves without words of tefillah and vidoy, which would have fulfilled their obligations to bring sacrifices, nonetheless, that could not bring atonement. Aval inoch inami sheyiskaper b'tefillah. But atonement could be gained through words of prayer, dahainu maseh hasmicha, which would be brought during the leaning on the animal. So to make sure we're hitting the nail on the head here, the Zera Shimshon is clarifying for us that in the Gemara Yerushalmi, when Rav Kahana said, interpreted the pasuk in Sefer Shmuel to say that the members of the household of Eli could not bring sacrifices in order to attain atonement, that meant they couldn't bring sacrifices if those sacrifices did not include words of tefillah and vidoy, words of confession and prayer, which means they would leave that out during the stage of smicha, of leaning on the animal. In such a case, they couldn't gain kapara. But if they had words of tefillah, if they did articulate words of vidoy and tefillah at the time of the korban or separately, then that would bring kapara. Next paragraph. Ve'od yesh lomar, and there's another point we can make to answer that second question about the role of tefillah with the korban. De me'ikara kushilesa. From the very beginning, we can say that the question really doesn't exist. It shouldn't have been asked. Midenokat kra zevach umincha dafka. The pasuk in Shmuel specifically used the words zevach umincha. We translated that loosely as a sacrifice and a meal offering. Shahare smicha shar hakorbonos. The step of smicha, of leaning on the animal, that is done with other korbanos, inachinami shehem vidoy tefillah. Of course, that involves confession and prayer. Aval asmicha shehayu osim al hashlamim. But the leaning on the animal that was done, if a person brought a peace offering, a korban shlamim, lo hayu el divrei shevach v'soda. They did not say words of confession. They said words of praise and thanks to Hashem. When you bring a korban shlamim, which is technically indicated by the word zevach, then you don't say these words of confession and prayer. You say words of shevach v'soda. You say words of praising Hashem and gratitude to Hashem. Lo vidoy utfila, not words of confession and prayer. Kemoshe kosav harambam, as the Rambam writes. This is also from the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. We're moving to the next page, column on the right. Paragimel anizkar la'el, in the third chapter, which was mentioned before. The zevach mashma shlamim. The word zevach, even though loosely translated, can be translated as a sacrifice, it really in the Torah specifically refers to a specific type of sacrifice. The korban shlamim, the peace offering dafka specifically. Ubemincha, and when it comes to a meal offering, ain't smicha klal. There's no concept of leaning at all, because a korban mincha involved a big container of flour and sometimes oil and sometimes a certain spice. But the point is, nobody leans on a korban mincha when they bring it. There's no smicha, there's no leaning on a korban mincha. And therefore, the Zera Shimshon says, it's almost as if he's saying, upon deeper analysis, upon further reflection, the whole second question of the Yefei Mara doesn't really apply, because if we look at the pasuk and read it carefully, we'll see that Hashem was saying, house of Eli, if you bring a zevach, meaning a korban shlomim, or you bring a mincha, you bring a meal offering, in which case there is no smicha, there is no leaning on an animal and saying words of confession and tefillah, you're not going to get kapara. But of course, if you use words of tefillah, then you can bring atonement, which is exactly Rav Kahana's point and deduction in the Yerushalmi. Now the Zera Shimshon will add a little more on this point. Ve'av ha'tenufa, even though when a person brings a korban mincha, a meal offering, they wave it around. Shegam hi kemo tefila la'atzor ruchos, which is a type of prayer to stop harmful winds and stormy winds from coming. And so you might say those are words of tefillah. Eina noheges bistam mincha. You don't do, a person who brings a regular korban mincha doesn't do the waving around. Kidisnan perak de menachos, as it's taught in the Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Menachos. Umishum hachi shapir ka'amar, and because when you normally bring a meal offering, you don't do the tenufa, the waving it around. And there, that could be considered a type of tefillah, but it's not normally done. It's only done by very specific types of meal offerings. Eino miskaper, that's why a korban mincha wouldn't bring atonement. Aval miskaper hu betefillah, but words of prayer could in fact bring atonement. So at this point, we can pause, because the Zera Shimshon has answered the second question of the Yefei Mara, and we now understand we can put that question to rest, because the Zera Shimshon has answered it exhaustively. He's given 2 different answers to the question, so we can put it aside and say, okay, we don't have to worry about that second question anymore. And so now the Zera Shimshon is going to go back and take a look at the very first question that was asked. The next paragraph, V'ala kusha harishona. And on the first question that was asked, Yesh Lomar, we can say, let's remind ourselves of the first question. The first question was, why did Rav Kahana and the Gemara Yerushalmi say that atonement wouldn't be brought through sacrifices, but it would be brought through prayer? Why not deduce it won't be brought through sacrifices, but it can be brought through any mitzvah? Let them do any mitzvah and it can bring atonement. That's the first question. We say in the 5th chapter of Masech the Brachos, Omer Rabbi Elazar stated, Gedola tefila yoser mimasim tovim. Prayer is greater than good deeds. She'ein lecha godol b'masim tovim yoser mimoshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom. No one did more good deeds than Moshe Rabbeinu. Ve'af al pichein, even so, lo nene ela b'tefila. He was only answered in terms of his desire to go into the land of Eretz Yisrael through his tefillos, through his prayers. Now, we know he wasn't allowed to go in, but Hashem did listen to Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillos and say, I'm still not going to allow you to go in, but I will bring you to a point when you can overlook the entire land of Eretz Yisrael and you can see it, even though you won't be allowed to enter it. And that only happened, that concession on the part of Hashem for Moshe Rabbeinu to see the land of Eretz Yisrael only happened because of his tefillos, even though Moshe Rabbeinu had an endless supply of masim tovim, of mitzvos and good deeds. So Rebbe Elazar says that shows us that tefillah is more powerful, is greater than masim tovim. That's the first statement that the Gemara brings. Ve'od amar Rebbe Elazar, and the Gemara brings a second statement by Rebbe Elazar. Gedola tefillah yoser min hakorbanos. Prayer is also greater than sacrifices. Shenemar, as the pasuk in Yeshaya says, Lama lirov zivchehem v'chule. Why do I need all of your sacrifices? Now, it's important to know how that pasuk continues. The Zera Shimshon only quotes the first few words. The pasuk continues and says, why do I need all of your sacrifices? And why do I need all of your tefillos, all of your prayers? V'im kain, if so, one second. And what he takes that, the way we understand that pasuk is to say that what Rabbi Elazar learns from the pasuk is that tefillah is greater, because if korbanos were greater, all the pasuk would have needed to say is Hashem to say, why do I need your korbanos? If korbanos are greater than prayers, we would know if Hashem is saying in this particular pasuk, in this particular context, what do I need your korbanos for? Well, if korbanos are greater than tefillah, Hashem didn't need to mention that he doesn't need our tefillos, because he already said he doesn't need our korbanos. However, Hashem goes the extra mile, so to speak, to say, what do I need your korbanos for? And what do I need your tefillos for? The only reason to say that second half of the pasuk is if tefillah is greater than korbanos, which is the point that Rabbi Elazar is making. Ve'im kain, if so, shapir ka'amar bezevach u'mincha eno miskapir. It makes perfect sense for Rav Kahana to say in the Yerushalmi that bringing a sacrifice and a meal offering won't bring atonement. But atonement can be gained through prayer. Because, as Rabbi Eliezer teaches us in Masechta Brachos, tefillah prayer is greater than korbanos. So the Zera Shimshon wants to answer the first question in a simple way, but as we're going to see, he's going to show us that it's much more complicated than that. But at least for now, the simple answer is, why did Rav Kahana say that tefillah could bring atonement? Why didn't he say any other mitzvah could bring atonement? Answer, because the Gemara in Brachos teaches us that tefillah is greater than masim tovim. It's greater than just doing good deeds and good mitzvos, and it's also greater than korbanos. So it would make sense for Rav Kahana to focus on tefillah and to use it as the thing that could bring atonement, even though sacrifices were told to the house of Eli would not bring atonement. Ella, next paragraph. Ella de Bahahi de Rabbi Elazar gufa yesh ledaktek. But we still have problems, because in Rabbi Elazar's statements in the Gemara in Masechta Brachos, we still need to analyze it and ask questions. Amai palginhu letrei bave. Why did Rabbi Elazar divide his point up into two statements? Hoyelo lomar gedola tefila yoser mimasim tovim uminar korbanos. Why didn't Rabbi Elazar simply say prayer is greater than good deeds and sacrifices? Why didn't he say that more straightforward statement, but rather divide that into two parts and say, number one, prayer is greater than masim tovim, and number two, as if it's an entirely separate statement, prayer is greater than korbanos? Why not really come right out and make a tremendously, seemingly more powerful, clear statement? Prayer is greater than masim tovim and korbanos. But Rabbi Elazar did not do that. He divided his point up into two different statements as if they're two totally different points. Zera Shimshon saying, why? That's strange. Why did he do that? Ve'od, in another question, v'bichlal masim tovim yesh gam ha-korbanos. Bringing sacrifices are certainly included in masim tovim, good deeds. Bringing sacrifices, the reason we bring korbanos, or at least the reason we brought korbanos in the time of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, and God willing, again in the future, was because we're commanded to do so. They are mitzvos. They are therefore masim tovim. They're good actions. They're good deeds. So why, again, it strengthens the first question. Why would Rabbi Elazar split up masim tovim and say prayer is greater than masim tovim, and separate from that say prayer is greater than korbanos? Korbanos are an example of masim tovim. Put it all together. Two solid questions. So we started with two fundamental questions. Then the Zera Shimshon answered the second question. Then he brought a kind of answer to the first question, but now that answer, which uses Rabbi Elazar's statement in the Gemara Masechta Brachos, the Zera Shimshon is saying, not so fast. We have to really get deeper to really understand what's going on. We're going to have to do a deep dive into Rabbi Eliezer and what he said and why he said it the way that he said it. Next paragraph. The Od Kasha, here Zera Shimshon's not done. He wants to ask another question. Im Isa Shahat Tefila Gedola Mena Korbanos. If Rabbi Elazar stated in the Gemara that prayer is greater than sacrifices, Heyach Anu Omrim, how is it that we say, and this is something we say at the end of the section of davening in the morning that's we call Korbanos, at the end of that section, how is it that we say b'da'agu u'v'shimamus? We say it with concern, with worry, and with desolation. U'neshalma parim sifasenu. We quote from the pasuk in Hosea, as you can see in the parentheses, Hashem, allow our lips, the words that we're saying with our lips, meaning the words of korbanos that we say in davening, allow them to be treated as if we're bringing parim, as if we're bringing sacrifices. Why do shetehei tfilasenu chashuva lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu? The whole point of what we say is that our prayers should be considered in front of Hashem, kamo hakorbanos, as if we brought the sacrifices. Why do we say that? V'harei hatfila, behold, prayers. Continuing in the next column, Yoser chashuva min hakorbanos. We just learned that tefillah is greater than sacrifices. V'chevon shehis palalnu. And since we're saying tefillah every morning, ein tzorech klal lekorban. What do we need korbanos for? They're even greater than korbanos. Powerful, important question. Again, another one. The hits keep coming. Zera Shimshon is saying, why do we ever talk about our tefillos hopefully taking the place of the korbanos, hopefully being considered in front of Hashem as if we brought the korbanos? Tefillos are greater than korbanos. So if we're saying tefillos, we don't even need to worry about korbanos. We don't even think about korbanos. We're doing something even greater than korbanos. That's a tremendous question. Next paragraph. Ve'im mipnei she'omru beperek hey de brachos, and if it's because we say in the 5th chapter of Masechta Brachos, miyom shecharav beis hamikdash nin'alu sharei tefillah, and if it's because the Gemara says from the day that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the gates of tefillah were closed. Very strong statement in the Gemara. The gates of tefillah, the gates of prayer were closed from when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Hayu lono lomar benusach acher v'lo benusach zeh. We should say things that with a different wording, not with this wording. Demashma didagoseno hi mibnei shahatfila ena chashuva kamo korban. When we talk about prayer and korbanos and our prayers being accepted as if we brought korbanos, we imply, our words imply that prayers are not as important as sacrifices. The ode, and that would be a problem. The ode, and another point, he gufa kami boilon. There's a question on the statement itself about prayers not being accepted after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Im sharei tefillah nin alu, if the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash brought with it the closing of the gates of prayer, lama anu mispalalim bechinam umibli toeles. Why do we continue all these thousands of years after the Chorban Bayesheni, the destruction of the Second Temple, with prayer? Why do we continue praying all the time? Umevarchem kama brachos, and why do we talk? Why is it important to say all the blessings that we say? Why do we make all the brachos that we make and all say all the tefillos that we recite if the gates of Sharei Tefillah, if they've been closed? V'lama dafka b'chorban abayis ninolu Sharei Tefillah uma inyan zeh lazeh. And why is it that it was the Chorban bias, the destruction of the temple, that resulted in the closing of the gates of prayer? What's the connection between those two things? Why does one thing result in the other? One more paragraph to go. V'hagam sheha'iyun Yaakov b'meseches bo b'mitzia peresh. Even though it's true that the commentary called Iyun Yaakov on Meseches Baba Metzia explains the following: De'i lav hachi, if it wasn't so, meaning if it wasn't the fact that when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, it weakened the power of our prayers, it closed the gates of tefillah in some way. If that was not true, lo hayinu dogim klal ala chorban, we would not be at all concerned about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Iyun Yaakov says, you want to know why Hashem took away, he reduced the power of tefillah, of prayer, after the destruction of the temple? It's because if God didn't do that, we wouldn't be worried about the destruction of the temple. We would feel, oh, destruction of the temple means no more korbanos, but we have our tefillos, we have our prayer, which is even more powerful. So Hashem, according to the Iyun Yaakov, had to reduce the power of our tefillos so we would feel the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Zera Shimshon says, okay, even though he says that, haloshen eino mochiach kain, the language used in the Gemara doesn't really fit with that. To ka'amar, because the Gemara said, the Gemara in Brachos quoted in the previous paragraph said, Miyom shecharav Beis HaMikdash nin alu sharei tefillah. From the day the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the gates of prayer were closed. Mashma shehachorban goram lazeh. That wording implies that it was specifically the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash that caused the gates of prayer to be closed. V'lo mishum kenas v'chashash, and it wasn't because of some kind of penalty or concern that Hashem had that, oh, they might not worry so much about the loss of the Beis HaMikdash, so I will tell the Jewish people that the power of prayer has been reduced now that the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. That's not what the Gemara seems to say. The Gemara seems to say the power of prayer was reduced or lost specifically because it was caused by the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. The Hoyolo Lomar, according to the Iyun Yaakov, the Gemara should have said, Achshav Shecharav Beis HaMikdash, now that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Ninalu, the gates of prayer were closed. Oh, or Lefi Shecharav Beis HaMikdash, or according to the fact, like based on the fact that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the power of prayer has been reduced or eliminated. O b'lashon acher, or it should have used some other language, kedei shielonu eze remez, so that we could have some hint that it's not the destruction of the temple that caused prayer, the power of prayer to be reduced. That we should get some hint in the language that's not what they wanted us to hear, that it's not causative, it's not directly related. The ode, additionally, Mahem elu hasha'arim shel hatfilah. One last question in this section, this first part of the piece. What did the Gemara mean when it said the gates of tefillah were closed? Hayalomar, it should have said, Ein tefillah seinu od mikubeles. Our prayers are no longer accepted since the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Why did it talk about Sharei Tefillah, the gates of prayer being closed, as opposed to just saying our tefillos aren't accepted after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash? So it's a shame to end here when we have so many questions that still need answering, but the Zera Shimshon goes on to develop at great length new ideas and novel ideas, and uses those to then come back and, of course, circle back and answer all of his questions, which we can, God willing, aspire to be together in good health, Mir Hashem, next year when we come back to Sefer Vayikra. Yashu koach for learning on in the Zera Shimshon together this week. We will look forward with the help of Hashem to continue learning in the Zera Shimshon on next week's Parsha.